Welcome everyone. As we get situated, Mrs. Vivian Filer is going to give us a welcoming and an introduction. So please kind of return to your seats. I want to take the privilege of the person who has the microphone now to thank Mrs. Vivian Filer from the bottom of my heart for the incredible work she does for our community, to keep us organized, to help us remember our histories, the hard times, the good times, the coalition building, the civil rights movement. I'm personally grateful to you, Mrs. Filer, because you have educated generations of students and young people all over this community. You've given talks at every high school, at every elementary school, right? You have mentored so many of my current and former students at the University of Florida. And you have helped them on their dissertations, on their senior thesis projects, on their seminar papers. So I just want to thank, let's all give a warm, yeah.
I want to thank Dr. Ortiz. He is just the most remarkable man himself and so easy to work with. But it's been a pleasure working with every single student that I've ever had a conversation with because they're interested in learning. But let me take this opportunity to welcome you not only to the Cotton Club Museum and Cultural Center. The board of directors here feel very, very grateful whenever you come to visit us. But today is a magic day. It's a magic day in that we are coming together as people of one decision, of one determination, of one goal, and that is to unearth the hidden truths that must be told. I always say that I don't like elephants in the room. And I don't know what color your elephant might be, but whatever color it is, if I'm in the room, we're calling that elephant out. So that just goes to show you, if you don't want me to call out your elephants, don't invite me in your room. And certainly don't give me a microphone, because that's my greatest asset. But the reason we're doing this, and I'm so happy to be a part of it with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, is that they have unearthed truth and facts. We here at the museum believe in telling the facts. Because we are not in the history books, there are very many myths and misconceptions that are placed in our history that aren't true. We want to do something about that. Dr. Martin Luther King was all about work. So no matter what we do in recognizing his work, he does not want us to have any more time to sit down and talk about what must be done. He wants action. In fact, his celebration is supposed to be a day when you go out to do something. It's not supposed to be a day you get dressed up and go to a banquet. You're supposed to take on a project and do something. That's what he wants. So today, that's what we're doing. And I'm so happy that I have the opportunity to recognize Dr. Martin Luther King and his work through this platform that we're presenting to you today. So I ask you to please get involved. I think you're going to learn a lot today. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Filer. And I'm going to migrate over to the podium here and just kind of let you know what we're going to be doing today. But again, to remind you that what we're doing today would be impossible without Vivian Filer. Over a year ago, the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program was invited by Doug Ray, who at that time was a senior editor of the Gainesville Sun, to take part in a historical truth and reconciliation project keying on the history of the Gainesville Sun and its reportage on issues of race relations, black history, political history, civil rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's what we're doing today. You can see on the easels here, and I encourage you when we break and have even more refreshments, to just take some time to look at some of the students' research that has really come together. Like I said, Doug really brought us together to do this work. And what I want to kind of share with you in advance before we start the presentation, to echo Mrs. Filer, this is some tough history. This is some appalling history. It's the history of one newspaper in the South that played an integral role in the creation and maintaining of white supremacy. That is the Gainesville Sun. So the Gainesville Sun is like most other newspapers in the South, right? In that sense, yes. In the other sense, no, in the sense that the Gainesville Sun is one of a small but growing number of Southern newspapers that want to come clean, that want to make amends somehow, want to be honest about the role that it played in the history of the making of one-party rule, black voter suppression, anti-black violence, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to take the opportunity to thank Doug Ray and the Gainesville Sun for starting this process. Let's give them a round of applause. This is kind of part one of at least a two-part, maybe a three-part series of public programs about the Gainesville Sun. Cleveland Tinker was going to be with us initially, and many of you know his incredible work in the Sun and the Gainesville Guardian. He can't be here today, but we do have a representative, a reporter from the Gainesville Guardian. Want to acknowledge her. Thank you so much for being here. So a future program will take the history forward. We're really focusing here on Reconstruction to World War II, and we're going to go a little bit beyond, but really the heart of it is in those earlier years. So let me get started here. Okay, it's not advancing. Everything is exciting when you're doing this live. So Adolfo, can you help me? And so as Adolfo is kind of getting this worked out, we have a number of slides that we're going to share with you about important events that the Gainesville Sun covered from Reconstruction to, again, roughly World War II and a little bit beyond that. Thank you, Adolfo. I appreciate that. Before I get started, I do want to acknowledge my co-panelist, Adolfo Romero, who just did that sleight of hand. Adolfo's interim assistant director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. He holds a master's degree in Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. And we're just really privileged that he's on staff. This young gentleman to his left, where I'm looking at, to your right, is Mr. Donovan Carter. Donovan is a current MA student in Latin American Studies at the University of Florida and a senior graduate researcher at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. So please give it up for Donovan. Donovan and Adolfo and other students have worked really hard over the past year unearthing aspects of the history of the Gainesville Sun, again, key events, processes, and I want to emphasize that all of this history is going to be accessible to everyone. Everything we do as a public history program and working with great mentors and guides like Vivian Filer, the goal is to make it accessible so that people can read it, can listen to it, can imbibe it. It does us no good if we keep it in our campuses and in our university. It's got to get out there. So that's part of what we're doing today. So I wanted to start with actually a very important lecture that was given in 1999 by William Pepper III. No doubt many of you here know him or know the family. The Peppers purchased the Gainesville Sun in 1917, and here he's giving a history of the Gainesville Sun. I'm not going to read this word for word, but essentially he is very honest about how this newspaper first begins. And again, this is very common. This is a common narrative for many, if not most, white-owned Southern newspapers from Reconstruction to World War II. Very explicitly, the Gainesville Sun begins as a white newspaper. It's very important, and this is something that Mr. Pepper wants us to understand in this lecture he gave at the Matheson Historical Society in 1996. In its very first issue, the Gainesville Sun puts itself on the side of the Democratic Party. Back in those days, the Democratic Party is known as self-known, self-titled, as the party of white supremacy. That's what this means. To side with the Democratic Party in 1876 is to be on the side of white supremacy. And the narrative that Mr. Pepper provides at the outset is one of carpetbaggers coming in to take over the South, to delude. He doesn't mention black people per se, but he mentions the recently enfranchised persons with little education who were somehow duped by these carpetbaggers. And he sets this up really as the history of why the Gainesville Sun was so important to Gainesville. The Sun was going to somehow set things right. But who are these carpetbaggers? Who are these newly enfranchised people that the Gainesville Sun during this time period made light of, made targets of humor, of vitriol? There were people like Matthew Louis and his family. And we're unearthing slowly more bits of information about people like Captain Matthew Louis. He was a Civil War combat veteran, really a Civil War hero. He almost died of his wounds at the Battle of Honey Hill. He relocated here at the behest of another Union Army combat veteran, Josiah T. Walls. He was very close friends with L.G. Chestnut. These are individuals you probably know, at least their names, right? But they're the people who were tarred unfairly by the early Gainesville Sun as the carpetbaggers, as the people somehow duping the newly enfranchised, little educated, freed people. But that anti-black and anti-Reconstruction narrative is so inaccurate, we can use events like this to really set the record correctly. There's three things that Reconstruction did for Gainesville, that it did for Atlanta, that it did for Jacksonville, that it did for Mobile, that it did for Jackson, et cetera, et cetera. Number one, the most important, is the general abolition of slavery. This is a great break. This is the greatest breakthrough in freedom in modern history. The abolition of the overall abolition, not the complete, but the overall abolition of slavery. The creation of the first ever public school system in Florida. There had been no meaningful public school system in Florida. Black people create that in Reconstruction. Their demand that all people have the right for an education, not just plantation owners, not just white elites, but poor white people. That's who black people were advocating for. Poor Hispanics. Gainesville had a large Cuban community in Reconstruction. How many of us have forgotten that, right? They play a very important role. The third overall creation of Reconstruction, invention, is the creation of the first democratic society in the history of this region, period. Democracy had never existed until Reconstruction. Very few people engaged in politics before the Civil War. This place was locked down by the plantation elite. None of you would be welcome to participate, none of us would be welcome to participate in politics during those days unless you were connected to the plantation elite. This is the breakthrough that Reconstruction was at the leadership of black people, but something that the Gainesville Sun couldn't really acknowledge. So I'll just kind of go quickly over some slides about Matthew Louis, a little bit of his career when he arrived here. He was the postmaster of Newnansville. He was the mayor of Newnansville. Remember when Newnansville was a rising town, rising city? Well, none of us were alive then, but it was at one point, you know. But Louis was formidable. And one of the things that angered the white power structure about Matthew Louis in this community is that he was his heroism during the war. He was a Union Army hero. And the Gainesville Sun narrative, as Mr. Pepper reminds us, starts right off with the loss of the Civil War was a tragedy for white elites. But for people like Matthew Louis, the Civil War was a great triumph. For ordinary people, for poor people of all colors, the Civil War and Reconstruction was a triumph. It was a great breakthrough. To safeguard that breakthrough, though, you needed armed self-defense. Many of you know the history of public schools in Gainesville. Black public schools in this region and throughout Florida and the South were frequently attacked by white Ku Klux Klan leaders because they didn't want black people educated. So Matthew Louis' combat experience, he leads a state militia company. All of the people on this roll, if you could read, including the Chestnut family, are African-American men. And their job is to defend our community from white terrorism. And when they're wiped out with the end of Reconstruction, then the reemergence of lynching and anti-black terror just really takes off in some horrific ways. Josiah T. Walls. When you look at the early issues of the Gainesville Sun, Josiah T. Walls, who's an internationally recognized congressman, again, a Union Army hero, is completely absent from the Gainesville Sun. He doesn't fit into their narrative of ignorant, uneducated, freed people. He'd been a slave, right? And he was able to free himself like Frederick Douglass and then go into the Union Army, and now he's a congressman in our county. Imagine that, to have a congressman of this character and quality who goes to the U.S. Congress in 1873 and makes one of the greatest speeches in the history of Congress in support of the Cuban War of Liberation against the Spanish. And I just excerpted this. And again, Ms. File, I'll give you a copy of our presentation, so I won't read this, but this is really amazing stuff. This is the importance of our community. This is an achievement of African-American communities that support this international struggle for freedom in Cuba. But getting back to Mr. Pepper's narrative, the narrative that the Gainesville Sun has of Reconstruction is radically different. It cannot accept the work of Josiah T. Walls. It cannot accept the dignity of Matthew Louis. It cannot accept the business acumen of L.G. Chestnut and the Chestnut family in the 1870s and 1880s. It has to promote this idea that black people are just not ready to participate in the society. And they're just going to have to lose the right to vote. They're just going to have to live in ghetto communities. They're just going to have unequal education. To maintain that myth, that's a lot of energy. Maintaining that myth is a lot of energy. And again, I don't want to just pick on the Gainesville Sun, because every white-owned newspaper in the South engaged in this myth-making. When Congressman Walls and Captain Matthew Louis left Gainesville at the end of Reconstruction, it was a catastrophe for this community. We lost so much leadership. Matthew Louis went on to become an internationally recognized journalist. He was a co-founder of the Associated Negro Press, an international body of black journalists from World War I on who covered issues in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. That was Matthew Louis, but he couldn't do it here because he essentially was expelled from the Republican Party. This narrative here is from my book, Emancipation Betrayed. You can read it more in depth there. And essentially the white Democrats and white Republicans got together and said, we need to fix politics here. If we're going to have voter suppression, 100% of black people, we've got to get rid of people like Josiah T. Walls and Matthew Louis. And so white Republicans and white Democrats got together and expelled both of those gentlemen, Captain Louis and Josiah Walls, from the Republican Party ticket. Can you imagine? The two greatest political leaders in the history of this community, to this day, expelled from their own party ticket. A disgrace. But something, again, the Gainesville Sun is not interested in talking about. In fact, as you see, the Gainesville Sun celebrates the expulsion of Matthew Louis and Josiah T. Walls. This is a tragedy for our community, and this is why I'm so glad, again, getting back to Doug Ray approaching us to say, what do we do to make this right? What do we do to get to the historical truth and reconciliation? But we have to start, to echo what Mrs. Filer said at the beginning, with some tough truths to figure out how can we change things. So I'm wrapping up my presentation now, But just again to remind you that Matthew Louis goes on to become an internationally recognized journalist. He has an incredible career, right? From the Army to politics to journalism. He moves to Pensacola, and you can read this at your leisure when you look at the presentation. So that's essentially my presentation. Oh, just a couple more things. So I wanted to talk about some iconic events. So how does the Gainesville Sun cover events like Rosewood or like the Ocoee massacre? One of the disturbing findings that our students have in this research is that oftentimes when there were these cataclysmic events like the Ocoee Election Day massacre, where an unknown number of black people are lynched and murdered because they tried to vote in the 1920 election, the Gainesville Sun's response after the election is for the editor of the Sun to brag about how he had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction. And he talks very bluntly about the discrete killings that produced the terror that they were designed to produce. This is an op-ed, y'all. Imagine for a moment, let's just have a moment of silence, and imagine you picking up your newspaper and reading an editor glorifying in violence, right? We talk about the problem of gun violence in our communities today, but imagine that an editor writes an op-ed like that today. And this was the Gainesville Sun, their response over and over again. It's pretty similar during the Rosewood Massacre 3 years later. An editor openly celebrating the Reconstruction era Ku Klux Klan and anti-black violence. But equally important, I think, is the silences, the failure of the Sun to honestly report on really vital incidents and elements and events in our community between Reconstruction and World War II, and this is one of them. On Tuesday, we're doing a presentation at Smathers Libraries where we're actually rolling out the task force report on African American and Native American history at the University of Florida. And this is one of the incidents we're going to be talking about. In 1917, a student, J.K. Fuller, this is back in the day when African American women would actually go to the university, physically pick up laundry of the young, white, affluent students, bring it back to their homes and clean it. You know, wash it, wring it, and bring the laundry back to the dorms at the University of Florida. So in 1917, there's an incident where Anthony Goins, who's a little boy, he's a little black child who was shot down by J.K. Fuller, who's a student. We still don't know the whole incident. It said that J.K. Fuller just shot through the door and killed this young Negro boy. We know there's more to the story. We're continuing to research into it. But the most important thing to me is that the University of Florida does something which it unfortunately often continues to do. Instead of doing the right thing, it looks to its governor to tell us what the right thing to do is. Okay? So instead of, and it's interesting, this is from an oral history in the Proctor program archives, where a classmate of J.K. Fuller basically says, you know, this was a terrible thing. A student shooting down a young Negro boy, don't you think there should have been some consequences for him? Oh, but Governor Sidney J. Katz intervened and said that student has such a bright history in front of him. We don't want to ruin his future. And so he does end up leaving the University of Florida, but he goes to another university and graduates. But the point here is that the Gainesville Sun didn't write one word about this incident. And this is a pattern. This is what our feminist scholars call silences. And there are many silences. Imagine a murder of a 10-year-old boy today, and the paper embargoes that news. Just embargoes it, just doesn't talk about it, because the University of Florida doesn't talk about it. The Gainesville Sun's silence during the 1924, when the Ku Klux Klan came TUF abducted, beat, and castrated Father Connelly. This is an event that Sam Proctor wanted us to remember, and he directed his students in the 80s to do oral histories with the last surviving people who could tell us about this event. Again, nothing in the Gainesville Sun about this shocking event. Total silence, in part because the University of Florida was silent about it. The final slide that I'll share with you is, and this is something that was part of the kind of everyday operation of Jim Crow newspapers in the South. Southern college football teams often play teams in the North. In this case, UF is going to play Boston College. That year, 1939, Boston College has a top-ranked football team, believe it or not. UF's team is kind of, middling mediocre. But here's an advantage that the University of Florida has over Boston College in 1939. Can you imagine what it would be? The University of Florida can ask and demand that Boston College bench its best players if they're black. Okay, it was called a Jim Crow Gentleman's Agreement. And so Lou Montgomery is the Boston College running back who's one of the best running backs in the country in 1939. And UF says, oh yeah, we'll go and play you, Boston College, but you have to bench Lou Montgomery. He can't play. And so UF ends up winning the game 7-0. And Boston College just can't get its ground game going. But see, this is something that happened every Saturday or every week in every football game where a Southern football team would play Northern football team. And this won't change until the late 50s and early 60s. But the silence of the Gainesville Sun, the sports page, is, what's that phrase? The silence is deafening? I guess because it's a great advantage that UF has over teams like Boston College. Imagine what an advantage it would be if you're coaching a team and you can go to the other coach and say, you got to bench your best players. Wow. So anyway, again, we're grateful for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Adolfo Romero.
Thank you, Dr. Ortiz. All right, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Ortiz, for giving us a sort of a lecture on our history, history that we should all should know. One of the things I want to say, I want to give thanks for everyone being here today, because acknowledging the truth, by you being here today, by learning what's going on, what has happened in the past, we're able to prevent this from ever occurring, number one. And number two, educate ourselves on what's really going on and not let people tell you, oh, this is what happened or didn't happen in the Gainesville Sun. Facts are facts. Articles are here. You're going to be listening to Mr. Carter present in a couple moments. But before we begin, I wanted to mention Mr. Doug Ray, because of him we were able to move this project along. But I remember when we started this was about 1.5 years ago. I remember once we went to the Mississippi Freedom Project, which that's through the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. We do that on a yearly basis. And I remember as part of that project, we went to EJI, Equal Justice Initiative, down in Montgomery, Alabama. And I remembered as we were there, a lot of people have been uncovering a lot of lynchings, a lot of incidents that have happened in the community. And that motivation, I remember coming back, I wanted to figure out what's going on in Gainesville, what's happening where we're living at. And that's what drove us to sort of connect with Mr. Doug Ray. And we connected. And once we connected, I remember we started working together. We went to the Gainesville Sun. We started putting an index together. I remember we even ended up countless hours going through microfilm. And we're talking brittle, it breaks in your fingers, literally in your fingers apart. To that point, a lot of those microfilms, and that's the type of microfilms they had, at least at the library at UF. And unfortunately, a lot of the issues, a lot of the incidents that you heard today, Dr. T speak on, such as like the killing of Anthony Goins. We could not find those articles. They were not there. They were missing. Somehow they were missing in the archives at the University of Florida, which was quite interesting. I would have loved to see, hey, did anyone mention any of this information? Unfortunately, we cannot find those records. Luckily, through the Gainesville Sun that year, which I believe it was a year and a half ago, a lot of those newspapers became digitized, all the way from like 1911 all the way to 1950, which we did not have access to before. So it was almost impossible to go through that collection and pull these articles. But once we opened that gate, we had the possibility to go in depth and look through those articles, which we did. And we organized them. We tried to figure out the best method. And the way that we did that is by themes. So today you're going to be listening to a lot of themes, such as lynching. That was one of the first things that I wanted to look at. What types of lynchings were documented, were not documented. From there, we moved on. And we're like, you know what? Why not expand the search? Why not do a key search for KKK? Let's see what's going on in there. Do articles appear from 1900s, early 1900s? And then obviously going even before 1911 or before that, 1890, we had to go through the microfilm still. But it was an experience, you know, as a researcher, something that we enjoyed, and it was something that we're definitely grateful that we were part of that experience to get back to the community today and talk about those results. One thing I want to mention, I invite all of you, this is part of the Challenging Racism at UF series. This is one of 8 public program series this semester that we have at UF, and we hope to be bringing issues, awareness about what has happened in the community. And I invite all of you to join us throughout the series. There's flyers in the back. All right, so one thing I want you to pay attention while we're discussing this is the attitudes of the portrayal of the Black community in Gainesville. That's one thing that I want you to pay attention, the type of words that they're using, the words that they try to present. Well, at that point, it was the Negro man, the way that they describe them. I want you to pay attention and see how do we see him, how do we see the Black man represented now in times, even through the Gainesville Sun. So those are things that I would ask of you for the day to think about. And what you're going to see right here today, this is just a small portion segment of what we have uncovered. Obviously, we could spend countless hours, and unfortunately, I have to say that, countless hours going through all this material because there's so much material out there that depicts the Black community through a negative lens, unfortunately. Remember, this is from 1900s, late 1890s, all the way to the 1950s. Now, we're going to talk about 1950s to 2023. That's a different case. That's for another public program. But for now, you're going to see what's the past, the foundation of the Gainesville Sun. So with that said, I want to pass it to my colleague who has invested many, many hours doing field research at the library, putting this presentation together. Everything, all the material that you see here is portion of what we have found. Like Dr. Ortiz mentioned a bit ago, all of this is going to be accessible online for all of you to view. Our goal here today to help educate the public on what's going on, what happened in the past, how do we move on, and reconcile those differences and silences, bring them back to life so we could acknowledge the past and move forward together. So with that said, Mr. Carter, do you mind coming to the front? Thank you.
Test. 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay. Well, first, thank you for such a warm welcome, Adolfo, and Dr. Ortiz as well. I want to start by, I guess, thanking and honoring. Oh, okay, better. Okay, sounds good. Thank you. I want to start by honoring I've noticed some people from the Rosewood Brigade here, so I want to start by, I guess, recognizing you guys. Could you just wave or raise your hand if you're coming from? Okay. A couple folks here. Great. Thank you guys for coming. Part of this project here is, like Adolfo was saying, from the jump, our goal has been about exposing the truth, recognizing the truth, and reconciliation of that. So, and this past week, through learning more about Rosewood and visiting Rosewood and being at the wreath-laying ceremony last week, it's just shown me how far that attitude and that holding on to the truth, how far that can take you. So, thank you guys for that, and I hope you guys keep the fight up. So we're going to go through about 10 articles, maybe. Each of these articles you'll see is up here in front of you if you want to come look at them later. So this first article is actually what Dr. Ortiz mentioned earlier, in which an editor from the Gainesville Sun admitted not only to participating as a member of the KKK, but also glorified it as defenders of white citizenship, white womanhood, Southern status, and pride. This is not only this, but the editor dismisses violence that's been attributed to the Klan. He claims that, Negro associations claim that the Klan has killed X amount of people, but this editor claims that instead that number is far less, half or a quarter of what is claimed. So the fact that this article is here and the editor is shamelessly and easily and freely expressing these thoughts and views really does show how comfortable the relationship is between the KKK and the Gainesville Sun, while showing how prominent members of society will kind of moonlight as Klansmen. We're going to see that again a bit later as well, or at least the Klan's voice being portrayed through the Gainesville Sun. This next one here is from January 10th of 1923. And this is a report actually on the Rosewood Massacre. Shortly after the massacre, the Sun frames a what they call a vagabond. I always have trouble pronouncing that word, but pushed a lie blaming a Negro, a lawless and criminal Negro, is what they claim, who started and initiated the violence and the madness that occurred during this time. And the Sun also advocated for vagrancy laws, which, as many of you guys know, are direct descendants of black codes and direct descendants of laws and policies aimed at restricting the mobility, the enfranchisement, and the freedoms of newly freed peoples. So this text was very, very striking to find and very, very powerful. It's one of the most, I guess, striking things we've seen, especially in regards to Rosewood specifically, to find something so close to the date of Rosewood, and so just continuing to push the narrative of white supremacy and of white innocence as well. So this is an article from 1917 in which a man is killed, or excuse me, a man is arrested for the alleged murder of a police officer. However, this article, though brief, it tells you a lot about kind of customs in Alachua County, and especially language and ideas surrounding criminality and black criminality. So firstly, one thing I noticed when I first read this piece was that the man who they arrested is never named. He's never identified. He's only referred to as the Negro Slayer and as a brute. And as we all know, a brute is an image kind of married to the white imaginary of a black man who is large, dangerous, violent, simple. And also what's interesting about this case is that this man, this unnamed man, unidentified man, was taken by prominent citizens, is what they're called, or citizens, and taken away before he can give a confession to the police. So to me, this implies that this man was tortured, beaten, and forced to give a confession, a false confession, and then handed over to custody. So this, I guess, serves as, in my mind, stories similar to this are something like the Central Park Five, in which children or people are forced to give a confession that isn't theirs and then handed over to the law. Let's see. And it just shows the level of coercion and abuse that was just rampant in not only culture, but also the criminal justice system as well of Alachua County. This article from September of 1922 is actually a response from the Ku Klux Klan, who was written to by someone in Alachua County. Now, the Sun publishes this in order to, because of the relationship that the Klan has with the Sun. So it's almost as if it's not quite an advertisement, but it's simply saying to the people of Alachua County that, oh, hello, you've written to the Klan, we hear you, and we're here for you for, quote unquote, a better Gainesville. So just something that we found that was incredibly odd and strange, that the Klan would feel such an ease of expressing their own voice through the Gainesville Sun itself, and announcing their presence in such a prominent and direct way through their own words. So this text is unfortunately of another lynching in which a young man, Henry White, was killed with no trial, no conviction or anything, and instead is perceived guilty by peers of entering a home and trespassing. And rather than dignify or even make attempts to dignify the victim, the Sun leans into the narrative that's been given to them, stating that the deceased, the accused, was actually a violent predator who deserved to be killed. So this article was actually very interesting as well, because January of 1924, this article announces the largest gathering of Klansmen in Florida at that time, in Gainesville, Florida, in Alachua County. So from 14 different counties, from Jacksonville and from other places, key Klan leaders, several thousands of Klansmen were expected to arrive in Gainesville. The following day, the 24th, January 24th, for some convention, some to perform some what they call commencements or ceremonies and things like that. Now, most interesting about this is that it shows how leaders in the Klan were coming to Gainesville. So, such as state Klan leaders. I'm not sure I have the titles. The Grand Titan of the Realm. I'm not sure what that means. Nor the Grand Dragon of the state. Very odd things, but very important Klansmen, evidently, coming to Gainesville in the early 1920s. So again, just reiterating that this relationship between Gainesville and the Klan is strong, and that the Klan is comfortable in Gainesville and in Alachua County as well. So 1923 as well, still January. This story is of a black man, Abe Wilson, who was killed after allegedly stealing cattle from someone out in Newberry. And so what was most striking about this was that the spectacle of it all. He was hung on a high tree, shot and killed, and he was hung for days. And hundreds of people, both black and white, came to view his body. So, and the fact that the Sun was producing this almost as an advertisement, at least to me, shows that just really fills into that narrative as well of white supremacy and I guess, the trend of race and racism being comfortable experiences for the Sun. This is one of the oldest articles we found. This is from 1904. We found this in the microfilm, looking through the library. It tells the story of a young boy who was run over by a wagon cart during a circus. The boy survives, but the editor and authors make light of his trouble. They don't name him. They compare him to animals frequently. They call him a monkey. They call him an urchin. They joke that he monkeys around, and they say things just to mock him and mock his experience and diminish whatever pain he may have been in. So 1904, much earlier, but still reflecting the casualness and how easy it was for the Gainesville Sun to, I guess, promote and portray black suffering and pain. So Bradentown, which is further than here, Bradentown, which is further than, I believe outside of Alachua County, but still, the fact that the Sun shows how this lynching and these lynchings just show examples of systemic racial bias, really, and how there aren't really questions asked about why these things are happening or questions regarding the evidence that produces or leads to these lynchings. And instead promotes them as just average, everyday occurrences. Similarly here, the cases of things occurring outside of the Gainesville area and even outside of the state. This is from Arkansas. The event occurs in Arkansas, rather. This lynching is actually of a white man who has allied himself with black people. He has a black wife and two mulatto children, mixed-race children. And this article, I guess, showed me even how dangerous it was to ally with black people at the time and how perilous your life would be even if you allied yourself with people of color, with black people. Malpass is named, Charles Malpass, the gentleman who was killed for helping his sons who were under threat of arrest and who were in a firefight with the sheriff. Later, Malpass is killed by a lynch mob. So this article, Adolfo was mentioning earlier about kind of the attitudes of the Sun and how writers of the Sun viewed black people. This is one of the most evident ones. In this article, the editor recalls fondly the times of Mammy's and Uncle Joe's, and directly says that wishes for the old-time slavery days. And so the fact that these stereotypes and these caricatures really are reflected fondly of by this editor and evidently his readers, the way he's writing about it as well, suggests definitely suggests a familiarity with and an ease of, just portraying racism and just really helps you see thank you, Deb, what the editors, and what this editor specifically, how he feels and what's going on in his mind. This one is probably one of the most striking ones that we've seen, that I've seen specifically. He even claims that there was an effort by the Daughters of the Confederacy, I believe, to construct a statue in Washington, D.C., kind of commemorating like Mammy's and Joe's, and he suggests that this effort was valid and I guess correct. So it also shows the absurdity of racism, I believe, as well. So, and that's all we have for you today. Thank you so much, and I'll have who's up next.
All right, thank you, Donovan. Mrs. Filer? Here.
Thank you. This has been so enlightening. Ella's song says, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes." I have to tell you that we're talking about things that happened back in the day. I wish I could say they weren't happening still. In another dimension, with more sophistication, but they haven't gone away. So I think unearthing information, as these young men have done by going through the archives, now that they're digitalized, of the Gainesville Sun, speaks highly of the places that we need to search into to find out what was going on. So this is Alachua County, just Alachua County. Think about it. We were African American in all of these places, all of these Confederate states that were doing the same thing. So we talk about it. I can personally attest to the fact that my father was going to be a victim of lynching. He was just a hair away from it, from misconstruing some incident that occurred that involved a white driver. So all of us African Americans can hear stories, or probably recall stories, that are associated with the like of reporting. I knew the Gainesville Sun in its day. I do know that we were a column about this size that was called the Colored News. And so the Colored News meant that they would put in there a few things about you. I have the, I don't know how to say this, it wasn't joyful, but I was in the Colored News. I wasn't happy about that because it did mean my mother got a Peachtree switch and sort of reminded me that I shouldn't have been there because my friends were having a dance and I was Lincoln High School's best dancer here in Gainesville. So it was a Tuesday night and I wasn't allowed to go. I mean, I'm not trying to be shame or anything here. All right, Miss Rentz, I see under that mask. But anyway, it was on a Tuesday night, so I wasn't supposed to go dance on Tuesday night. But the library, they had made the library that next to the Rose B. Williams Center. They had turned that little place into a library to keep us out of the library downtown. So the dance was on Tuesday night. I could just drop my books there and there innocently walk next door to the dance and I won. Hey. 25-cent pack of notebook paper in the Gainesville Sun is what I was holding, and my mother saw it. But that's not the only. So that's a bit of humor. But the other thing is all of the atrocities that were going on were not in the Gainesville Sun. Mr. Childs was the editor for the Colored News. We would go by his house right off of Fifth Avenue there on 8th Street and drop off the tidbits that we wanted to get into the newspaper that most of them didn't get into the newspaper. We were called the Colored News. You realize nationwide we had to graduate up to the Colored News because we came from where? We came from the N-word. You all remember the slurred way they said Negro? They could slur it in such a way that it stopped being Negro a long time. It went on into the Negro, but they justified that. And then we say, who came out with making us feel good about it? James Brown. He said, say it loud. Hallelujah. Let's shout about that. Then we decided to name ourselves for our motherland. We named ourselves for our motherland. I'm saying all that to say that this struggle is so entwined in so much that picking up these pieces and going forward is one way of getting the elephant out of the room. But it does require us to pay attention to each little aisle that we walk down and find out how can we be a Martin Luther King and do something about it. So I'm proud that we're unearthing these untruths or these hidden truths so that we might do more. I made notes as they were talking, and I thought I listened to the fact that African American women picked up laundry from the University of Florida in 1917. They also picked it up in 1950 because I helped to wash it. It wasn't a good thing because my mother washed for this guy who only wore white, long-sleeved cotton shirts. And that was before we had Argo starch. Y'all, anybody old enough? All right. hanging them on the line and all that. It was all day Wednesday and all day Thursday to get those shirts that she was paid 25 cents a shirt for. So we'd have to walk those there and walk them back. So it was a dangerous place to be, and it wasn't a very pleasant place to be, but that's the life we lived in Gainesville, Florida. We had one black policeman, one who rode a bicycle. They wouldn't give him a car, who did not have a gun, did not have anything. He just had the respect of his people. So he could command and demand and take care of us on that back. Sergeant Lewis, he'd ride that bicycle all over, and we would see him. But wherever he was, he had the respect of those people around him. Gainesville has a lot of embedded impurities, you guys. We are just uncovering a little bit of it, and I'm so glad that we're doing that. But I am not trying to so much be as a part of this research as I am trying to augment it in ways that we all feel the need for it. We might individually find a way to not only try to get into the fixing part, but try to learn more about where the inequities were, because we're never going to clean up anything until we find out how dirty it is. I'm a nurse. I talk about a wound that's all covered up and things are growing under the skin. Until you open it up and clean it out and debride it and wash it out and put some antibiotics in there, you're not going to get healing. So this is a wound that we're opening up. And is the Gainesville Sun any better now? Well, it's better. Everything is better. But I look at it as if it is a drop in the bucket, and there still is a long way to go. When I look at it, I think about the fact that people talk about integration. Everybody wants to say we're integrated. I am so appalled by that term when I hear it. I told the past president, University of Florida, when I was there last for an event, they had a whole event, everybody talking about how the university went from desegregation to integration. They didn't ask me to speak, but I sure had my chance to when they did what they thought was question and answer. I told them I didn't have a question, I sure had a statement, and I said, I want you to stop talking about getting integrated since you haven't done it yet. You've gotten desegregated. You've gotten desegregated, folk, but in this world that we live in, we have black schools all over. And here, now, you know, Dolores, I'm gonna do it. I have to get a drink of water first, because I have to get ready for this, because all of you all might leave when I finish drinking my water. But I'm gonna get the water anyway. My sisters and all are looking on, they're gonna say, oh, there she goes. Here's what I wanted to say though, is we have to stop trying to pretend that we've gotten there, because we're not there. We're proud that there are all of us, black and white, Hispanic and all, working toward getting there. But there's always white privilege staring us in the face. Now, you didn't create white privilege. You may not even demand white privilege. You don't have to. You don't have to open your mouth. You just have to be white. But you're not going to change that. But what you have to do is use that in a positive way to help us all have the same privilege. It can be done. It can be done. We're not trying to be white. We're just trying to be human and try to have the same respect, the same equities, the same everything that we deserve, because unless you know African American history, you don't know history. Is that right? So how can you know my history if you never come to something like this? How can you know my history if you never heard or read about or done something to know more about the Rosewoods of the nation? Rosewood is not the only city that went through that kind of degradation, but it is in Florida. It is our history. We have to know that. By the way, my goddaughter got the first award from the Rosewood. My granddaughter is Tiffany McDonald. So I feel like I'm a part of that just from the outside. But what I'm trying to say is keep on coming to these events, but don't walk away and think you've done a good thing and it's over. We all have to work. I know a lot of you are working. You need to tell the next generation, if you're my generation, most of you aren't, But it is every dime. How can we have racism still going on? Well, because those people who are in the background of these younger people have taught them how to be racist. We have to start teaching how not to be racist, as hard as they are teaching to be racist. So we have a responsibility, and we have to figure out how to do it. I don't know how we're going to do it all. I'd like to think that I know how to do some, and all I don't know, I'm willing to learn. How can we make this different? Well, we at the Cotton Club Museum and Cultural Center believe that we tell the factual truth. We tell it in such a way that we try to back it up. We try to get it over here. We try to get you in so you can see, learn, understand, and try to be a part of who we are and what we are trying to do. I made a lot of notes, and I was trying to see if I had just about covered them all, and I think I did. And I don't want to prolong the time because I want you to have some time for Q&A. But I appreciate your being here. I appreciate what we're doing together, and I do claim all of you as those people who are trying to make a difference, and I appreciate you celebrating Dr. Martin Luther King in this manner.
Thank you, Mrs. Filer. All right, so now we're going to the next portion of this public program, and that's going to be Q&A. So let's open it up to the public for now. Are there any questions? Please raise your hand.
I will repeat the question from here so we don't have to, yeah. So, and could you tell us your name? Oh, I thought you had a question. Okay, there you go. Okay, yes, please.
Okay. Sorry, y'all. My question basically revolved around media control. So as we know, there can be a certain demonization of victims of hate crimes and things of that nature, basically trying to put the perspective on what the victim should have done to stop these things from happening, such as the Trayvon Martin case, like, oh, if you were innocent, why were you running? Things of that nature. So I wanted to see how you felt those articles that we were talking about back in the day align with some of the articles we can even see now, and how as we as a people can push the media away from those dangerous tactics.
Well, that's a great question. So I definitely hear what you're saying about image and media control. Those tactics and strategies of victim blaming and things like that are definitely still present today. In terms of kind of reclaiming the narrative, I think that's part of that is creating a space that those close to the victim, maybe their families or things like that, have the chance to speak. So one thing I love about the oral history program is last year in 2021, 2 years ago now, I was able to go to Washington, D.C. and do interviews with impacted families of police brutality and police violence, and give those families a chance to counteract the narrative that the police or the media have given about their loved ones, that the victims aren't criminals, they're not scoundrels or villains, or they didn't deserve to die at the hands of law enforcement the way they did. So part of that, what you were saying, countering the narrative, is creating a space for the truth and a new narrative to be presented and expressed.
Your question is fabulous, and it really animates why we're doing what we're doing here, the research, so thank you. And we're going to continue to stay with your question, during part 2, when we kind of move forward in the history of the Gainesville Sun. I want to acknowledge the work that people have done in Gainesville on the Police Review Board, and again, working in some cases with media, the Gainesville Sun. Many of you know Sheila Payne's work. Sheila, Mrs. Filer, and other people going to the Gainesville Sun because of the popular movement. That's what I want to emphasize. It's got to be connected to a social movement. It's not one-on-one. That's important. But thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement, created some momentum for us, Sheila and others, to go to the Sun and to say, if you're going to report on issues of crime and justice, do what Donovan is saying. Hear all sides of the story. There's more sides to the story than the arresting officer's side. You put a person's picture in the newspaper and you say they've been arrested for a crime, which they may or may not have committed, and the next morning, it's all over the schoolyard. And Sheila would tell people, she would tell the Gainesville Sun, she'd say, you don't understand what you're doing to this community. How corrosive it is to put someone's picture in a newspaper and say that they've committed a crime when you don't know they committed a crime. Whatever happened to innocent until proven? And this is one of the unfortunate legacies of Jim Crow newspaper reportage that Mrs. Filer referred to. How much better are things really now? They won't get better unless we agitate and organize. And the work that was done locally here to get the Gainesville Sun to modify its coverage on the so-called police blotter, very important, but it's ongoing. It's got to continue.
Hello, my name is Jacqueline Collins, and I'm a resident of Gainesville, lived here all my life. Ms. Fowler knew my mother and this community, but I applaud what you people are doing in terms of trying to get the truth out. That's not easy. You are trotting up a road that's not yet been paved or even laid out. You're in the weeds. But I applaud what you're trying to do. And how will you continue to do this? And will you print now that the things that has happened with the Gainesville Sun? And because it seems like it would have to be discredited in some way for people to understand that something has happened, because the majority of the people that have read the Gainesville Sun over the years are not black people. And so the people that need to be educated, how are they going to accept these truths that you're talking about and think it's factual and believe that some credit is to what you're saying?
It's a great question. You know, how do we continue with this work? And my colleague Adolfo Romero was talking earlier about this public program is part of a series called Challenging Racism with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, you know, working with the Cotton Club, working with other important organizations. We're actually having an event next month here again with Mrs. Filer keynoting to talk about kind of where do we go from here? The great question that Dr. King left us in his final book, Chaos or Community, where do we go from here? And one of the things we can do, I feel, as an oral history program is just continuing to dig, just to kind of echo what Donovan was saying earlier, dig as deep as we can and kind of uproot things. That's, you know, kind of the definition of grassroots social change. You know, look at the work that Carol Richardson is doing at Aquin Jones Museum. We all can work together on this great project. The great Aimé Césaire said, you know, there's room for all at the rendezvous of victory. And we have to use what we have. So on Monday, as Mrs. Filer has reminded us, we have Martin Luther King Day. We can either make that meaningful, or we can just say, oh, it's a holiday. But I suspect that the people here are going to make it meaningful in their communities, in their neighborhoods, in their institutions. So we're going to continue doing this kind of research at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, but the key is, to me, as an educator, it's also getting into the schools. And one of the projects we're working on now is called Reanimating African American Oral Histories. And it starts with the foundation that Joel Buchanan really helped lay for us many, many years ago. And we're using the Joel Buchanan Archive in African American Oral History to make lesson plans and then to get those in the school districts in the state of Florida where they really belong. We create courses at Santa Fe College and the University of Florida, and that's wonderful. We have great Black history courses. We have great Black studies curricula at UF. But unless we're getting it out into the schools and the community centers and the senior centers, I feel we're not doing the job. So we have a lot of work to do, but I think we can do it, but we all have to, I think, see ourselves as part of that work.
Hi, can you hear me? Johnny Nelson, Gainesville. I graduated University of Florida with a master's in '78 in history. I went on to teach many years at Miami Beach Senior High School. I was the African American history teacher. I also taught at Miami-Dade North College. One of the things that my kids would ask me all the time was what can be done to slow down or to eliminate the ultra-violence, black on black, in Miami. That's what they knew, or other places, Chicago. I never had a good answer other than improved socioeconomic conditions. I wonder if you could cast some light on this black on black violence, which I don't think is discussed enough because it's become a lethal part of the black community, and that's what worries me so much. Thank you.
Well, now, if you're familiar with black institutions, this is talked about constantly, every day, in black churches, black labor unions, black schools. So, yeah, I mean, black on black violence is something that is talked about within black organizations every single day. That's not really the problem. The problem is, as Dr. King said, we are the most violent society on the planet. We create more weaponry, we sell more weapons, both here in the U.S., but also to other nations. I'm a veteran of U.S. Special Forces. I was in Central America in the mid-'80s. You may ask what my job was. I trained young men in Colombia, Honduras, all over how to shoot, how to kill. I was a 20-year-old sergeant in U.S. Special Forces. Why did my nation send me to Central America to train people how to kill each other? And then I come back and I read a headline saying, gun violence is a problem in American society. Well, no duh, gun violence is a problem in American society. This is why Dr. King said that we're the most violent nation on the planet, and when are we going to deal with it? So, yeah, there is black on black violence. There is a black on black violence task force in Alachua County that's been in existence for many, many years. African Americans, white people, Hispanic people serve on that task force. So we have that discussion covered very well, believe me. The larger problem is violence in the society writ large, and what we do to promote violence all over the world. What I've done, I'll spend the rest of my life making amends for the violence that I promoted in Central America. So I'm a member of Veterans for Peace. That's what I can do. I can advocate for nonviolence. I can march on Monday with Mrs. Filer and many of you, and that's what we can do to try to make amends for the violence that we have visited on ourselves and on the rest of the planet. Sorry I got in a soapbox.
Remember the wound that I talked about needed debriding? Well, this issue of black on black crime is not just about the peripheral part of killing somebody. It's rooted because African Americans are the poorest, they are the most underserved. They were taught in slavery to kill each other, and to be beaten, to inflict pain, to do all of the awesome, awful things they did. A lot of African Americans have not come out of all of the historical horrible things that were done to them. It is not easy to be black. Let me tell you that today. If you think so, come over here and let me shed some black on you, because it's not easy. So these young people who haven't overcome that, we don't even know how deep it goes. But I know there are things done. We need to do those things. But I am so tired of black people explaining to white people why they're in the condition that they are when they didn't start it. I'm sorry, I had to say it.
All right. One more question.
Oh, one more? Okay.
Yeah.
There's like 80.
Well, maybe.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lawrence Rockwood. I went to graduate school and got my master's PhD in history at the University of Florida. I was lucky enough to have Dr. David Colburn on my dissertation committee, probably the person probably most important in investigating and studying the Rosewood Massacre. I have a question focusing on this idea of deafening silence. I think this is something that's very much with us today. And I'd like to ask, what part does the idea of boosterism play in that deafening silence? Basically, I'm not saying boosterism is racially neutral, not at all. But the privileged, the people with the highest economic states in the community also want to bring in new residents, new business. They want to bring in students to go to school at the seminary and later the university. And there's historians, we talk about historical voice. I think one thing going on today, very much so in this city, whether we're talking about whether Rosewood is part of Gainesville history, or if we're talking about should we have the name of murdered students up on a wall on 34th Avenue. I think if you want to see where's this deafening silence comes from, and I think what role does boosterism play in controlling what the Gainesville Sun publishes, whether today or back in 1923, and also you see it today on things like Wikipedia, where you have this agenda of deafening silence over incidents in our past.
You know, this question of silence is really important, and it's something on Tuesday we're going to be talking about that task force report, the University of Florida's role in, either bringing truth to light or enforcing a kind of a silence that you're referring to. Tuesday, the event is at Smathers Libraries. What time does it start? 5 p.m. And so this is one, we're going to be talking and certainly remembering Professor Colburn and his incredible contributions to both the Rosewood Task Force, which was so historic, and then his role as a historian, being one of my guides and mentors too. And I think when you take an event like what happened to Father Connelly in 1924, where the Ku Klux Klan, in many ways, literally comes to UF, kidnaps this man. He's, at that time, one of the most popular professors at the University of Florida. And they accuse him of promoting Catholicism, because UF wasn't just a white male institution, it was a white male militant, white nationalist Protestant campus for decades. Father Connelly is a World War I veteran. He's a chaplain. He's the founder of our first drama club at the University of Florida. But the Ku Klux Klan doesn't like that because he's very popular. They accuse him of being too Catholic. At the time, we had governors who connected anti-blackness with anti-Catholicism. Governor Sidney J. Katz, as Dr. Colburn taught us, he won Florida governors won elections on violence. Y'all, if we're going to talk about violence, Governor Katz bragged about killing a black man on his campaign trail. And for him, that was how he garnered black votes. And he also claimed that Catholics and black people had a secret cabal, a secret plot to undermine the society. So the Ku Klux Klan was allowed to come on our campus, kidnap our most beloved professor, beat him, castrate him, leave him for dead in Palatka, and the Gainesville Sun and the University of Florida joined together to do absolutely nothing. That was a devastating event in the history of our campus, because if you could get away with that kind of atrocity and no one says anything about it, there's no white on white crime violence task force then or now. We could ask ourselves, well, why is that? There's a lot of violence in white communities. But back then, there definitely was not, such a task force. So what we can do now, though, to remember Father Connelly is really important. To echo what Vivian Filer's doing here at the Cotton Club, your board of directors, Mrs. Filer, you're doing that work that's helping us. Like, we weren't there in 1924. I can't blame anyone for what happened. And to echo Mrs. Filer, if you're a white individual, if you're not black, you're not to blame for that. But what can you do now to create a society of equality and truth and honesty? So I'm just so amazed at the Gator Catholic Center, because now they have that story of Father Connelly, thanks to the research that Sam Proctor directed in the 80s. It's on their marquee. If you look at the website, they say right up front, this was an atrocity in our community. And our university let us down. Our newspaper let us down. Everyone let us down, but what we can do now is remember Father Connelly's name. That's the least we can do.
Hi. Hi, Carol Richardson from Acorn Jones Museum. Thank you so much for your presentation. My personal feelings about the newspaper, because you know that I run an independent radio station, so I definitely believe in the radio and news owned by the people. But it seems to me that in the 1920s, when this was all happening, that the Gainesville Sun was used as a tool to uphold the ideology of those of the ruling elite. So with that being the case, and the Gainesville Sun said, hey, we want to now go back and look at how we reported lynchings, or we reported how the African American community was treated back then. Has the Gainesville Sun made an effort to actually publish the truth and to apologize to the community? Because you've done all this research, you've got all these great things that the Gainesville Sun asked you to do. So what is the Gainesville Sun going to do to actually apologize to the community for its reporting?
And that's what we want to know. That should be for February's issue, right? Like coming up, we should definitely have that discussion with the Gainesville Sun and see what do they plan to do now that we've talked about this. An apology would be the beginning to that start.
And part of the challenge is that, as you know, Carol, there's been a big shakeup at the Gainesville Sun, and not just here in Gainesville, but in many other parts of that corporate chain. A lot of local reporters are being laid off. It's a time of turmoil in the Sun. Doug Ray is actually no longer working at the Sun proper. So, but yeah, I mean, again, where do we go from here? We have the research. If the Sun, and the model, we have the Alachua County Remembrance Committee chaired by Commissioner Charles Chestnut, who was in our presentation, his ancestor in our presentation. So I think we can connect that work of the Remembrance Committee to the Sun and to say, hey, let's talk about now. What can we do, not just going forward. As a historian, by the way, I hate that phrase, going forward. As you may suspect, I hate that phrase. Because too often people use the phrase going forward to kind of imply, well, it doesn't matter what happened in the past. Let's forget about the past, right? But I think the theme today is let's not forget about what happened in the past. And so, yeah, let's ask the Gainesville Sun. In the case of the police blotter page, we had, one specific victory, which is if you say innocent until proven guilty, and that is a value the society is supposed to be built on, it's a nation of laws, not people, then Gainesville Sun, do the right thing. And in that case, they did. So, but that was a much more specific kind of thing. Mrs. Filer, I think.
I just want to say we are absolutely taking the last question. I didn't have a response. I do think it's a very good question, but we'll hear the last question now, and then we will ask if you have other questions to ask them of the panel after we close. Thank you.
Dottie Fabacy, resident of Gainesville. Actually, my question comment has to do with the Gainesville Sun. More than ever, like Donovan said, getting those stories out there, we need a local newspaper. Our newspaper right now, we don't have hardly any local news. We don't have letters to the editor. It's a shame. We need our newspaper. I don't know if there's anything any of us can do, but how do we get the word out there without a daily newspaper? Thank you.
Well, you know the answer to that? Does anyone know the answer to that? Do you know the answer? Yeah.
So my answer is, yeah, we need a daily newspaper in Gainesville, in Jacksonville, in Tampa, everywhere, more than ever. The idea remember that idea that the Wikipedia was 100% accurate? How old are you? I'm dating myself now, right? But this idea that, social media has had a devastating impact on accuracy in news. We've got to have daily newspapers, but my answer is that we're going to have to look at some way to publicly support daily newspapers across the country. To me, there's no other, because if you tell me, I've had many colleagues in the Warrenton Business School tell me, well, Paul, the free market says that daily newspapers are a dinosaur, they're a thing of the past. So if that's the case, we've got to think about other ways to sustain daily newspapers. And one of those ways is what can the public do if we value those. I mean, Carol pointed out a very important source, also radio. What are we doing to support local radio? What are we doing to support local media writ large? So I don't have the answer, except we got to think about some kind of public way to sustain, I think.
I know you have a question. I'm going to ask you to ask the panel after we close. We do have to close. This can't go on forever, but we want you to follow the program. You have the outline of where we're going from here, and I'm sure that you're going to learn more. You're going to have even more questions. So on behalf of everyone that's here for this wonderful research, this great information, I want to thank you for including us in the way that it's being presented and letting us be a part of presenting it to the community, because you can't fix it if you don't know it's broken. And so this has been a great afternoon as far as I can say. So I'm going to ask you if there's food in the back, help yourself to it, and we're going to rise and be dismissed by Vivian Filer. Thank you.